Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out today to see these presentations. So my name's Zoe, and my capstone project is on the fruits of our neighbors, or on food trees, fruit, and volunteer engagement in Toronto. I worked on this project with Not Far From the Tree, which is a fruit picking and sharing project in Toronto that I'll discuss more in a little bit. So I want to start off by talking about the context. Ooh, that's a problem. There we go. Okay, cool. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the context of this project. Urban food trees are all over the place in Toronto. And when I talk about urban food trees, that's a very broad umbrella, including true fruit trees like apples and pawpaws, shrubs like elderberry and serviceberry. And for the purpose of this project, I'm including grapevines in this group because they fill the same niche to most people living in Toronto. There are more than 200 small fruits and berries native to the Toronto region. However, many of the trees that are most common in Toronto arrived with early waves of European settler colonists in the 17th and 18th centuries, specifically apples, pears, plums, cherries, and nut trees. In fact, it's really important to recognize that many of these trees were tools of colonization as settlers reshaped the landscape to be familiar and welcoming to them. So fruit trees have a complicated reputation when it comes to the public. A review of research on urban food trees done by Park et al. In 2019 found that food production is the primary benefit discussed when it comes to urban food trees. Recreation, education, connection to nature, good social relations, and habitat value are also frequently mentioned, but food production is really number one. But fruit trees are also sometimes considered a nuisance to the point of being framed as ecosystem disservices. Residents often complain about fruit fall, which can damage infrastructure and property, as well as attract wildlife and insect pests. Also, when it comes to using urban food trees as a food source, especially with fruit, there are some logistical challenges. Fruit trees bear large amounts of fruit at once and need to be harvested within a few days of ripening. They require tools to harvest, especially when they're over head height. They also bear variable harvest from year to year. So a tree might have a huge mass year one year and then bear only a few pounds of fruit the next year. Then the fruit that's harvested has to be stored or processed correctly, which requires time, space, tools, and energy. So in Toronto, these food trees exist in the context of widespread hunger and food insecurity. Last year, according to the Canadian Income Survey, 18.6% of Torontonians experienced food insecurity. This number has remained stable since 2019, so surprisingly, this proportion did not increase, at least according to Stats Canada during the pandemic. Food insecurity essentially means not being confident where, when, or whether your next meal will come, and it has severe health impacts from undernourishment to vitamin deficiencies to mental health effects. The definition of food insecurity also includes a lack of access to fresh food, such as fruit. So Not Far From the Tree is working to kind of bridge these overlapping landscapes, the ecological landscape of food trees and the social landscape of widespread hunger and lack of access to fresh fruit. Not Far From the Tree is an urban gleaning organization here in Toronto, which coordinates volunteers to pick fruit from trees on private land. They were established in 2008, and they're one of a few urban gleaning and fruit sharing projects across Canada. And this here is their vision. We envision a Toronto where everyone has access to the urban harvest as part of a resilient local food system that builds community and is based on the value of shared abundance. So they work towards realizing this vision mostly through coordinating fruit picks. This process is started by a homeowner or tenant registering a fruit tree on their property with Not Far From the Tree's portal and requesting a pick within a certain span of time. Then a pick leader, who might be a volunteer or a staff member, chooses a date and time when they can lead that pick by bringing supplies to the tree and then transporting donated fruit to a partner agency. That pick is then published on Not Far From the Tree's portal, and there are spaces for 5 volunteers to sign up to participate. After a tree has been picked, the fruit is divided between the homeowner, the volunteers, and a partner agency, as long as the fruit is good quality enough to be donated. So this map here is just to give you an idea of where Not Far From the Tree operates and where their current agency partners and storage locations are. Most of these storage locations are in people's backyards or at partner agencies. Most of these agency partners are food banks, but some are also shelters or community centers. So in order to do this work that they do, Not Far From the Tree needs a sense of where their program is at now so they can work towards expanding the area and the people they serve in the future. That's an issue because of the limitations of the data management systems currently available to them. The portal they use does a good job of scheduling picks, but it retains that information in a super obscure way. So that leads me to the central issue that I'm tackling with this capstone, which is that up to this point, Not Far From the Tree did not really know who their tree registrants were, where they were, and how consistent those trees were in getting picked from year to year. They also did not really know who their volunteers are, where they are, and how consistent they were in getting engaged from year to year. And it's really vital to have this baseline information in order to be able to assess the program, figure out how to engage more people, and above all, how to keep people engaged so that there's a reliable volunteer base across the operating area coming back from year to year. So in light of that issue, my objectives are to first examine the pattern of tree registrant distribution and consistency across Not Far From the Tree's operating area in terms of tree type, age, yield, and surrounding area. And secondly, to quantify the Not Far From the Tree volunteer, pick leader, and tree registrant base in terms of both initial registration and consistency. And this all works towards answering this overarching question of what does Not Far From the Trees program look like right now in terms of trees and people? Before we get into some of the answers to this question, I'll talk briefly about the data I had to work with. On tree registrants, I have the tree type and height, the address it's at, and its pick history, which includes the date it was picked, the pounds picked and donated, the subjective quality, and the recipient agency. On volunteers, I have their name and contact, their residence, the picks they've attempted, and whether they're a pick leader or staff and Not Far From the Tree. And I did all my data management, analysis, and visualization in Excel, RStudio, and ArcGIS Pro. So let's get into the results. This map shows all the trees that Not Far From the Tree has picked from 2015 until today. You can clearly see these two main clumps in the east and the west end, with gaps in the financial district, as well as up to the north, as well as in Scarborough and Etobicoke. So for context, Scarborough and Etobicoke were only added to Not Far From the Tree's operating area this year. And the most straightforward gap for this, the most straightforward explanation for this gap in the center of Toronto is yard size. This area is super heavily developed, so there's just not the same space to maintain fruit trees on private property. Also, the legend here covers all the fruit types that Not Far From the Tree picks, so we're going to look at a simplified version on the next slide, but just for reference, the most common fruit tree types are apple, cherry, crabapple, grapes, mulberries, and service berries. So this map here, that title says postal code counts. These maps show trees summarized by which postal code they're in. For example, one of these polygons is M6G. The top left here shows all trees. So the postal code with the highest number of trees has 175 trees contained within its area. You can see in this map that trees are mostly located in the West End, especially in Little Italy and Little Portugal, where grapes, which are in the top right here, and apples in the bottom left are very present, which makes sense given the cultural history of the area. It's also interesting to see on this slide how mulberries, which are down there in the bottom right, have their heaviest numbers in the East End. This is possibly because they've been planted mainly as ornamentals there, and then people get either frustrated or enchanted with how much fruit they generate, and they enlist Not Far From the Tree's help in picking. So this graph here shows the yearly total number of trees picked, as well as how many of those trees had previously been picked and which ones were newly active. So just to situate ourselves, this top line here is 300. So the peak number of trees picked is about 350 and the lowest is about 90. The first thing we see here is that the yearly number of trees picked is variable, with low years in 2017, 2019, and 2020. That last one was influenced by the pandemic and volunteer availability as well. However, the overall trend in the proportion of previously picked trees to newly active trees is rising steadily over the years, which you can see. I also want to point out that between 2018 and 2019, Not Far From the Tree switched to a new method of scheduling picks using their online portal rather than scheduling manually via email. So now I'd like to get into the results relevant to Objective 2, which was basically about volunteers. So this map shows volunteer residents by 6-digit postal code. So one of these dots is M6G 3G8. Most striking here is that while volunteers are clumped in downtown Toronto, again, especially the east and west ends, there are these areas to the north in Etobicoke and Scarborough that are less dense. But you can see that volunteers really do come from pretty far outside the operating area. As far north as North York, and you can't see it on this map, but there are some volunteers who registered from St. Catharines and other farther away places. So this map shows the same data, but normalized by the population of each 3-digit postal code. So for reference, in the darkest red, the highest proportion here in the West End, about every 2 out of 1,000 people volunteers with Not Far From the Tree who lives in that postal code. So when it's normalized this way, you can see that there's really a pretty intense hotspot there in the West End, which makes sense because that's where a lot of registered trees are located and is easier to volunteer closer to home. So this made me curious about how closely tree and volunteer enrollment align. And the answer is generally pretty closely. Any postal code that's not shaded here has a similar association between trees and volunteers. The ones in green have a high number of volunteers compared to number of trees, and the ones in tan have a low number of volunteers, which opens up this possibility of doing more outreach in those areas to get volunteers involved since there are trees to be picked close to where they live. Now, to round off our results on Objective 2, these graphs show the yearly totals and retention levels from year to year for volunteers in general and for PIC leaders. The highest count that volunteers reach is around 400 up there in the blue graph. And every year, between 30 and 50 of those volunteers are also PIC leaders down here in the red graph. Unfortunately, the data here doesn't go as far back as it does for tree registrants, but you can still see a generally increasing trend in the number of volunteers who were previously involved from year to year, while the proportion of PIC leaders who have previously been involved hovers pretty consistently around 2 to 3. So just to broadly review those results and their immediate implications. First of all, the patterns that show up when I was investigating both of these objectives really emphasize the importance of data collection and management, both for current program assessment and for future planning. So specifically for Objective 1, which was to understand the trees and tree registrant base that Not Far From the Tree is working with. The strong point here for Not Far From the Tree is tree registrant retention. People keep coming back to have their trees picked, which keeps the program going. We also saw those clear hotspots and gaps, both of fruit trees in general and of more specific species, which speaks to the degree to which cultural and ecological landscapes weave into each other. This also brings up the need for more data on unregistered trees on private land, essentially a yard tree inventory. Since the 2 biggest empty areas are in the newest parts of their operating area, I would recommend tree scouting, which they already do to some extent and is basically just walking, biking, or driving around looking for fruit trees in yards and then slipping a flyer into the door. So I'd recommend that in these areas, since it seems as if this lack of trees is coming from lack of knowledge or not far from the tree or for other reasons, rather than lack of trees, which is the culprit in the downtown area. So as for Objective 2, which was to understand the volunteer base, we again saw those interesting hotspots and gaps. Where volunteer engagement is low, Not Far From the Tree can try to figure out why that is and whether they can engage more people in those areas. I would also recommend, in general, increasing presence and outreach in their new expansion areas, Etobicoke and Scarborough, and in the zip codes which had a low number of volunteers compared to tree registrants, especially to see if there's any reason they can find for lower engagement there. So as I said before, volunteer retention levels are climbing, but they're still not as high as Not Far From the Tree would like to see. And it's difficult to make a recommendation on that topic with a limited number of years of data and no qualitative information. So I would recommend a future kind of mini project done by Not Far From the Tree, consisting of a survey of volunteers to investigate why they do or do not return to working with the project. So finally, when it comes to the question of expanding the program, getting more people involved and picking more trees, there's one major place where fruit trees are and where Not Far From the Tree is not, and that's on public land. So let's talk a little bit about picking on city land. This isn't necessarily a recommendation for Not Far From the Tree since they're already working on it, but just something I wanted to discuss a little. This map on the right here shows fruit trees on public land in Toronto. You can see but you can see there's really quite a lot of them. In fact, there's an estimated 20,000 fruit trees on public land in the GTA, according to the city's 2017 street tree inventory. There's also a city bylaw in the book banning the removal of organic material, so fruit, from city property, including park and boulevard trees. The city itself, especially when it receives complaints from residents about high levels of falling fruit, has tried to figure out an arrangement with Not Far From the Tree, but so far nothing has come to fruition. This brings up some very meaningful questions, like issues of access on public land, how to determine who's responsible for harvesting and caretaking parts of the ecosystem like fruit trees, and how legislation on land and land tenure is very important to this nexus of the social and ecological landscape that I keep on coming back to. In closing and thinking about the question on this slide, I wanted to reflect on that interaction and overlap of the social and ecological landscapes here in Toronto. The benefits that volunteers and the broader community get through volunteer participation are at this nexus of the social and ecological. They include low impact fresh food, stronger social and community networks, and increased ecological engagement and investment in green space. All of these contribute to what's often called a sense of place, or a meaningful attachment to a specific community and ecology in which you reside. Sense of place is responsible in many ways for increased engagement with and investment in people's surroundings. And in my opinion, it's vital to sustaining a healthy city. So why does this matter to urban forest conservation? I would argue that intentional human participation in our surrounding environment and ecology is the keystone of all forestry, especially urban forestry. Since fruit trees require a special degree of caretaking and understanding in order for us as humans to benefit from them and have a meaningful relationship with them, I think that Not Far From the Trees work and the concept of urban food forests in general is a really valuable frame for understanding urban forestry as one of the building blocks of a strong and engaged community which takes care of its neighbors and trees. And finally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported me as I worked on this project, especially my supervisors, Dr. Sandy Smith from the university, and Julia Trenia and Rachel Lissner from Not Far From the Tree. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Zoe. So first, I'm going to call on Rachel Lissner, who's in virtually, to ask a question.
Hi, Zoe. Congratulations. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm really proud of you. And thanks so much for shining a light on the work that we do at Not Far From the Tree. I have a lot of questions that I would love to ask you, like regarding data management, like how we could do that better, what kind of education we can do, things like that. But I think, I guess one question I would have is what kind of education could Not Far From the Tree provide for fruit tree registrants, whether they're people who have been with us for a while or people who are kind of curious about what we do? Because we show up as an organization that just offers to pick the fruit, but I would say that education right now is a theme that is not as present in how we connect with people. So if you have any thoughts on that, I would love to hear what you think.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So the question was basically like, what kind of education should Not Far From the Tree, or like information should Not Far From the Tree be providing to tree registrants to get them kind of more enmeshed in the program? Because right now, Not Far From the Tree basically like shows up and picks the trees, which is great for the tree registrants, but that's kind of all the engagement they have. I think this is an interesting bridge between my work and Frida's work. I think it's really relevant to what both of us have done. Frida's about to present. But I do think that, especially working with Not Far From the Tree over the summer, I met a couple volunteers who were also tree registrants, and I think they had a very different perspective on the program than people who just volunteered or people who just like had a tree in their backyard and wanted to get it picked. So I think like, I knew this wouldn't be possible for every tree registrant, but I think really encouraging people who have registered a tree in the program to come out on a couple picks and like talk to other people with fruit trees in their backyard so they can like share resources and also like get a little more enmeshed in the community. I think that would be a really valuable experience for tree registrants.
Great. Thanks for the question, Rachel. And if I didn't say it before, Rachel is Zoe's external examiner. So now I'm going to ask Sandy to ask a question.
I'm just trying to get help to get the sound louder so that someone can actually help. I guess what I was trying to figure out is the total number of trees picked. It's limited, but what's it limited by? Like right now, and this is part of what Not Far From the Tree has to kind of grapple with, like this number of 300 or whatever. What do you think are the main drivers on that? You touched on them, but what do you think's really restraining that?
Yeah, that's also an interesting like bridge between mine and Frida's work, because I like one of the main reasons, at least anecdotally, is that like people are planting less and less fruit trees in their backyards, and people have less and less knowledge on how to take care of them, and less like desire to have them, especially like something. So I live in the Little Italy neighborhood. So this is very anecdotal, but like there is so much development happening in that area as houses are like torn down and rebuilt. And even if like a property isn't completely reformed, then like because fruit trees are really sensitive to like root impacts, then the development will like most likely kill them within the next like 5 years. So I think that's a limiting factor in terms of time. And then in terms of space, there really is like there are so many fruit trees on public land in Toronto that like the fruit just kind of goes to waste unless there are people nearby who like know to pick them, or not to waste, but like it's not used by
So do you
humans.
think the
Yeah.
constraint is, it sounds like you think the constraint might be trees rather than people? Or, I mean, they're
That's
integrated, but
I think the constraint definitely is more trees than people, because also there are like it's kind of a fight to get onto a pick and not far from the tree system.
really?
Like people have the page on auto refresh in the background while they're doing other things so that they can sign up for one. So it's definitely, yeah, it's not like a lack of volunteer interest in the program. It's definitely limited by trees.
so that would really argue to try and, let's say, push the city a little bit on this, like the public land. Is there some way that we can engage more of these volunteers who are so keen to do this in some safe way? Any ideas on how to go about that?
Yeah.
Like, what did I say? How to start picking fruit on public land? Because it's so important, but
That's also something that both Not Far From the Tree and the city have been working on. And they've talked about it a bunch in the past, especially there are like alleys of serviceberry trees that like residents complain about, and the city is like, we want to get these picked. But because the city has to go through the RFP process and like submit an open call for proposals, they can't just like set up an arrangement with Not Far From the Tree. It's such like a bureaucratically long process for like a harvest with a very limited seasonality that like the timing has just not worked out every year.
right. It's probably been difficult too, because we were over COVID, so it's hard to like everything separate out what that impact is. But there are clearly some years that are really low.
Yeah.
And that's a tree constraint probably too, right?
Yeah,
Because of
definitely.
massing.
Or like 2017 at least is
Yeah.
like, because as far as anyone remembers and as far as I could find, there wasn't any volunteer limitation that year. It really was just fruit trees were not bearing as much, or like there were fewer harvests, which made it like worth requesting a pick.
And my last question, it's general, was more like you started with food security, and I know all along we've been talking about this, you and Frida, and the interest with Not Far From the Tree, but I'm kind of wondering, it makes me wonder, how much do you think the fruit trees help food security? Like in principle, they do, and we can all make that connection because it's food. But what part, I guess, how much of the tons that go are actually really helping food security for those who can't afford it?
That's
Like,
Yeah.
that's a big question. I know it's
Yeah.
a big question.
It definitely is a big question. I mean, it's certainly true that not all of the fruit that is donated gets used. And there are also times throughout the season when partner agencies will be like, you gave us 100 pounds of apples last week. Like people don't want them anymore. Like our kitchen can't process them quickly enough. But then on the flip side of that, there's also like, it is like a really lovely way for like food banks especially to receive like a load of fresh fruit and be able to like put that out without really doing anything to it. And like people like definitely do use and eat it. But it's also, yeah, like it comes down to a question again of like, who has the time to process this, who has the experience with these fruits to eat them, like who actually wants these, and like who would rather eat like something else that's more like familiar to them and more like comforting to them, which is like a completely understandable choice about food. Yeah, it's a huge question. Yeah.
Thank you. Some really interesting constraints there to think about for sure. I think we have some questions from our virtual attendees. Laura, do you want to read those out?
Okay, this is a question from James Marcucci. When it comes to fruit trees, there is a negative reputation at Toronto community housing areas that they attract rodents. TCH residents experience food insecurity at a higher rate than average Torontonians. Do you think fruit trees attract more rodents than an average tree? And how can we ensure fruit trees are in place for those who need it the most?
That's the answer to the first question is a hard yes for sure. Just because it's a food source. It's a food source for us. It's a food source for rodents. Yes, they attract more rodents. But I like this question of how can food trees be in place for people who need them the most? I think you really do thinking about this issue of caretaking, you really do need a system in place beforehand to make sure that somebody has the resources and the energy and time to harvest those trees so that they don't become a pest attractant, or so that if they do, that's an issue that is either not an issue to the people around them or it can be managed. So I think the physical ecological aspect of fruit trees that they provide fruit is great, but then from the human side, we need to have a solid enough relationship with the trees we're planting that we know that we can pick them and take care of them into the future so that they do essentially what we want them to do.
Great. And I think there's one more virtual question that we have time for before I ask the audience here.
Okay, and this is from Rachel. So, given a lot of struggles and lack of familiarity with fruit trees, do you think we should be encouraging people to plant more fruit trees? Would our urban canopy be better with more fruit trees or other types of trees?
I think both yes and no. I think they should be in the mix because I think with my answer to Sandy's question, the program is limited not by volunteers, but by trees. So there is this desire to use the fruit trees that we currently have. And especially with a program Not Far From the Tree in place in the city, that makes it a lot easier to take some of the burden of picking those trees off whoever's planted them. So I do think fruit trees should be in the mix, especially I think Frida will talk about this, but the city had a serviceberry planting initiative, which is a very easy fruit tree to take care of and manage the harvest. But also, do I think that crabapple trees should be planted down every street? No, definitely not. So I think it's as with any urban forestry planting question, it's an issue of what space are you planting the tree in, what species is appropriate, and who will be around to take care of that tree.
Thank you. All right. Are there any questions from the in-person audience? Yes. I guess I'll bring the mic over to you. 1 second.
Thanks for the presentation. So if I'm a landowner in Toronto and I have a fruit tree in my front yard and I have a fruit tree in my backyard, from with what Not Far From the Tree does, could you only pick in the backyard and not the front yard?
Are you talking about the road setback for public land?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
It's a sneaky little question because I think many fruit tree registrants are the tree is on their front yard and given the setback, it's that's technically is city land, but also it's not the city is going around trying to bust people for picking something on the setback. Yeah, so it squeaks by on a technicality, but both of those trees could be registered and picked. Yeah, interesting. Cool. Thanks.
Can you go back to the postal code slide? The one before this?
Yes, which one?
The heat map, postal code heat map. Yeah. What's that little spot down by the harbor? What is that?
I believe, honestly, my geography of the waterfront isn't quite good enough for me to be confident about that. But I think there is a little pocket of like Spadina Museum coordinates like extensive like fruit picks every year. So that's not Spadina Museum, but I think it's another like technically private land, but organization that has a bunch of apple trees that get picked every year. Yeah, sorry, I wish I could remember which organization it is.
Okay, thank you.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much, Zoe.
Yes.
One more round of applause.